In the quiet northern forests, where dawn arrived first as a pale silver mist curling between the ancient oaks, a young man walked lightly, yet each step carried a weight unseen by ordinary eyes. Aragorn, called Istel, by those few who knew the truth of his origin, moved with a deliberation that suggested both caution and purpose. The forest breathed around him, a deep, measured rhythm that seemed to pulse in tandem with his heartbeat. Here, far from the cities of men and the watchful eyes of Gondor, he was free to trace the contours of the world as it truly was, wild, old, and resonant with the echoes of time. And yet, freedom carried its own burden, for every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow sliding beneath the branches, reminded him that his lineage, though hidden, marked him for a destiny beyond this silent woodland. He paused at a clearing, where a stream meandered through mossy stones, its surface catching the early light like scattered fragments of silver. Kneeling, he cupped the cold water in his hands, watching the reflection of the sky ripple and fracture. In the mirror of the stream, he glimpsed the weight of his own anticipation, the unspoken promise of a future shaped not by ease, but by necessity. His gaze lingered on the distant hills, their dark silhouettes a quiet reminder of Arnor's vanished glory, a kingdom now reduced to memory and whispered legends. The banners of Gondor, the stones of Minas Tirith, even the echoes of Elendil's halls, existed more as echoes in his mind than tangible reality, yet each left a resonance he could not ignore. In this solitude, the mechanisms of leadership, responsibility, foresight, and patience were lessons learned without tutor or court, inscribed instead upon the bones of the land itself. Estell's thoughts drifted naturally to the stories that had nurtured him in secret, tales of Númenórean kings whose light had once stretched across the seas, now fractured into lineages scattered and diminished. He remembered the careful words of his foster father, the man who had kept him safe beneath the shadow of Weathertop, speaking of courage as a quiet thing, a force that did not boast or demand recognition. In those lessons lay the first understanding of what it meant to inherit not only blood and name, but the subtle burdens of expectation. Fate, as his father had whispered, was not merely a sequence of events, but a weight one carried, and one must learn to bear it with steady hands, even when the world offers no guidance. These reflections were interrupted only by the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canopy, a reminder that the forest was alive in ways that humans rarely perceived, its rhythms interwoven with histories older than the kingdoms of men. He rose and began again, tracing a worn path that twisted beneath boughs and bracken, each footfall measured and deliberate. Here in the forest, Aragorn felt the threads of his own story tugging at him, whispering of duties unseen, of alliances yet to be forged. The forest itself seemed a mentor, its ancient roots and hidden glades teaching patience, observation, and the humility that comes with knowing one is a part of a far greater weave. Every fallen branch and mossy stone held a lesson. Every shifting shadow suggested a truth to be discovered and understood. He thought, too, of the Dunedain, the scattered remnants of the northern kingdom, who, like him, bore a legacy largely invisible to the wider world. In them, he saw a reflection of his own isolation, custodians of a past unclaimed, yet crucial, guardians whose presence mattered quietly, almost imperceptibly, to the currents of history. In the forest, time moved differently. The sun's ascent was measured not by bells or proclamations, but by the slow illumination of leaves, and the gentle warmth seeping into the stones. Aragorn felt this subtle cadence resonate within him, reminding him that his life, though destined for grandeur, required mastery of restraint and understanding of limits. The legends of his ancestors, recited softly in the candlelight of hidden chambers, were not mere stories of heroism, but of consequence. Victories tempered by loss, leadership entwined with sacrifice. And so he walked, absorbing the world, attentive to the small mechanisms that governed life and death, aware that knowledge alone was insufficient, unless coupled with measured action. At a bend in the path, he came upon a glade where sunlight broke through the trees in a pale golden column, illuminating a small cairn of stones. He paused, sensing a presence beyond the physical, a faint echo of history preserved in the land itself. Here, perhaps, once walked the heroes whose names now only lingered in song and memory. He traced the stones with a finger-tip, feeling the roughness, the uneven surfaces, the patience it had taken to arrange them. In that quiet, he recognized a principle that would guide him always. Legacies endure not solely through grandeur, but through persistence and attention to the delicate, often overlooked threads of life. The cairn, humble and enduring, mirrored the path he would eventually walk, marked not by loud proclamation, but by steady, resolute action. Moving on, Aragorn's mind considered the broader patterns, the unseen structures that shaped the lands of men and the fragile balances among their realms. The remnants of Arnor, the scattered outposts and ancient stones, were like pieces in a delicate lattice, each element small in isolation, yet capable of sustaining the weight of kingdoms when properly understood and aligned. It was this awareness, cultivated in solitude, that would enable him to read the undercurrents of power, to discern the quiet levers that moved armies, influenced alliances, and altered the course of events long before they erupted into visible consequence. Knowledge of this sort was neither glamorous nor public, but it was necessary. The cost was immense, for it demanded vigilance, patience, and the humility to observe without interference until the precise moment demanded action. As afternoon waned, the forest began to shift in hue, the silver mists retreating in favor of warmer shadows that stretched across the roots and fallen leaves. Aragorn paused once more by a stream, listening to the gentle lapping of water over stone, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The solitude was not loneliness, though it carried a weight similar. It was the quiet shaping of character, the cultivation of perspective and restraint. He considered the horizon, where distant mountains marked the unseen boundaries of Arnor's former reach, and wondered what it would mean to reclaim what had been lost, not merely as a claim of blood or title, but as the restoration of order, of hope, of stewardship grounded in understanding rather than entitlement. These thoughts settled over him like a cloak, providing both comfort and a subtle reminder of the responsibilities that would one day fall upon his shoulders. The forest, ever patient, seemed to recognize this preparation. Birds nested quietly, shadows lengthened with deliberation, and the wind carried whispers that might have been history speaking through leaves. Aragorn's pace slowed, attuned to these signals, aware that even the smallest details could offer guidance or warning. He reflected on the teachings of those who had guided him, the balance between secrecy and visibility, the art of moving unnoticed yet remaining ever vigilant, the quiet cultivation of strength tempered by wisdom. In these early years, such lessons were not abstract. They were lived, breathed, and absorbed in every cautious step through underbrush and along stony paths. As the sun dipped lower, casting a final amber glow through the canopy, Aragorn finally paused at the edge of a hill overlooking the distant lowlands. Here, the world seemed to stretch endlessly, each valley and ridge a story waiting to be understood. The lineages, the remnants of kingdoms, the echoes of past triumphs and failures, they all converged quietly in the mind of the young ranger. He felt, in that moment, the duality of his existence, a life of wandering and observation, and the latent promise of kingship, entwined as inexorably as shadow and light. The day's journey had been both physical and meditative, reinforcing the rhythm of patience, the discipline of restraint, and the unspoken understanding that destiny is never immediate. It is nurtured slowly, deliberately, through choices small and sustained, until the moment arises when action can meet preparation. Night settled over the forest in soft layers of blue and silver. Stars, tentative and distant, pricked the sky with quiet authority, and the wind stirred the branches with the faintest murmur, as though affirming the lessons of the day. Aragorn set his gaze upon the horizon one last time, feeling the subtle pressure of the legacy he carried, yet unafraid, for he had begun to understand that strength was measured not only in action, but in awareness, vigilance, and endurance. The path ahead was obscured by shadow, and yet within that darkness lay the quiet certainty of purpose. Every step taken, every lesson absorbed, every moment of observation in this northern forest was preparation. The world beyond these trees was vast, fragmented, and waiting. And in its waiting, it had already begun to shape him into what he was meant to become: a guardian, a leader, and one day the king of Gondor. In that hush, where night and forest merged seamlessly, Aragorn allowed himself a single, steadying breath. Tomorrow, the path would continue, and with each stride, the invisible threads of lineage, responsibility, and destiny would guide him ever forward, toward a future that was not yet revealed, but already quietly insisting upon his attention. The forest exhaled with him, a rhythm ancient and unwavering, as if acknowledging that the journey had begun in earnest, and that the boy known as Estelle was already learning the shape of the man he was destined to become. The morning mist clung to the northern hills like a quiet veil, softening the edges of the world and lending a hushed rhythm to the landscape. Aragorn moved steadily along a narrow, winding path, his cloak brushing against bracken and low-hanging branches, each step deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. The forest had yielded its lessons in the day prior, and now the wider world opened before him with a subtle, unspoken complexity. Though he carried the hidden weight of lineage, in this life he was known only as Strider, a ranger whose presence was fleeting and whose deeds were whispered rather than proclaimed. Yet even in obscurity, the mechanisms of leadership and responsibility were at work, shaping him through observation, decision, and the quiet management of consequence. Each movement through the rugged terrain was a rehearsal for the intricate dance of authority he would one day inherit. The trail led him past the edge of a crumbling stone bridge, where a shallow river gurgled beneath arches worn by centuries. Aragorn paused, eyes tracing the lines of the stones, their surfaces weathered but steadfast, a quiet testament to endurance. In these remnants of human craft, he saw reflections of the principles that governed life and rule, the balance between permanence and vulnerability, the necessity of foresight, and the subtle art of maintaining what must endure while allowing for the inevitable erosion of time. In silence, he touched the rough surface, feeling the cold resilience beneath his fingers, and sensed the lessons embedded in these foundations, lessons that spoke to the careful stewardship required of a man who must someday reconcile the past with the demands of the present. Each relic was more than stone. It was a symbol, a mechanism of memory and guidance, quietly instructing him in the discipline of endurance and the patient application of knowledge. Moving on, Aragorn entered a grove where the air was saturated with the scent of pine and damp earth, and where light and shadow intertwined with deliberate subtlety. The forest here was dense but not suffocating, and he navigated it with the ease born of familiarity, attuned to its rhythms and concealed pathways. The life of a ranger, he knew, required both attentiveness and discretion. Every step, every glance, every decision carried consequences invisible to those who moved only by sight. He listened to the whisper of leaves and the distant murmur of a brook, calibrating his movements to the pulse of the land. These skills, though unremarkable to the casual observer, were integral to survival and to the cultivation of the quiet authority that would one day define him. Each observation was a thread in a lattice of understanding that spanned the natural and human worlds, an invisible preparation for the alliances and confrontations that awaited him beyond the borders of these wild lands. As the path descended into a low valley, Aragorn's thoughts turned toward the scattered remnants of the Dunedain, those few who remembered the vanished kingdom of Arnor and maintained its principles in secret. He had seen them in fleeting glimpses, men who moved with purpose through the hills, guardians of knowledge and territory, their presence nearly imperceptible to outsiders. In them, he recognized echoes of his own life, exile tempered by vigilance, anonymity sustained by principle, and the quiet labor of preserving legacy when no one else might notice. The mechanisms that bound these rangers together were subtle. Mutual recognition, coded signs, shared values, and an unspoken commitment to a duty beyond personal ambition. The cost of this life, however, was never far from his mind. Solitude was constant, companionship limited and transient, and the satisfaction of achievement deferred until it might bear the weight of necessity rather than vanity. A sudden rustle among the bracken drew his attention. Aragorn crouched instinctively, hand resting on the hilt of his sword, eyes scanning the undergrowth. A deer, startled and graceful, bounded across the clearing, its movement a reminder that the forest lived and breathed with energies indifferent to human ambition. He exhaled slowly, the moment a meditation on patience and observation, reinforcing lessons learned in years of quiet wandering. Even the smallest life in these lands operated according to patterns, consequences, and rhythms that mirrored the intricate structures of men and kingdoms alike. Understanding these patterns, he knew, was essential not only for survival, but for the stewardship of greater realms, where the interplay of power, loyalty, and timing could decide the fate of nations. Each observation, each pause, was part of a curriculum of preparation that demanded attentiveness and reflection, qualities as necessary as any weapon in the trials to come. The valley widened into a series of rolling hills, their gentle slopes dotted with stones that bore faint inscriptions, echoes of human presence long faded into memory. Aragorn traced the carvings lightly, reading their shapes as one reads the subtle signs of history, the quiet architecture of precedent. These remnants, often overlooked, were critical mechanisms in the shaping of knowledge and understanding. They reminded him that power and legacy were rarely maintained by force alone. They required attention, patience, and the quiet cultivation of trust and foresight. The cost was invisible to the untrained eye, yet profound. Every miscalculation, every failure to heed history, could cascade into consequences far beyond the moment, shaping the destiny of people and places in ways only later understood. In this contemplation, Aragorn's steps became both literal and metaphorical journeys, as he navigated not only the terrain before him, but the currents of legacy flowing invisibly beneath it. By midday, the sun had broken fully through the clouds, illuminating a high ridge that framed the distant outline of a settlement, faint but discernible beyond the forested hills. Aragorn approached cautiously, observing from the shadows before revealing himself. The village below was modest, its structures of timber and stone arranged with practical precision. Yet the life within was neither chaotic nor unstructured. Here, he saw the quiet mechanisms of human society at work, the exchange of goods and information, the subtle enforcement of norms, and the careful balance between cooperation and competition. He recognized the lessons inherent in these interactions, understanding that leadership required observation of the small threads that held communities together, and that authority was cultivated as much through perception and timing as through any overt assertion of power. These principles, learned in the microcosm of a village, would resonate later when he confronted challenges on scales far larger and stakes far higher. Crossing the ridge, Aragorn descended into the settlement, allowing his presence to be noted without drawing unnecessary attention. He engaged with the villagers with the lightest of gestures, greetings, small inquiries, the casual observation of patterns of labor and social interaction. Each encounter was a mechanism for understanding, a test of discretion and empathy. The cost was measured in vigilance, the mental labor of sustaining awareness across multiple interactions, and the subtle balancing act between participation and observation. Breadcrumbs were scattered through these moments, a merchant's cautious words, a child's unexpected curiosity, a soldier's subtle glance. Each would later illuminate threads of alliances, loyalties, and tensions that existed far beyond this modest place. Aragorn moved among them like a shadowed guide, learning without disrupting, gathering knowledge that would inform the decisions of a future he could not yet fully claim, but could already perceive as inevitable. As afternoon softened into evening, he withdrew to the outskirts of the settlement, where a small hill overlooked both the village and the river beyond. Sitting against the trunk of a tree, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, contemplating the convergence of natural and human rhythms. The forest, the hills, the river, and the people were all part of a continuum, and his own path was interwoven with these elements in subtle but inexorable ways. He considered the lessons of lineage, the echoes of Arnor, and the quiet demands of guardianship, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility in tandem with the practical knowledge gained through observation and discreet interaction. The life of a ranger, though uncelebrated, was already shaping him into a figure capable of reading not only terrain, but the hidden architectures of influence and consequence. Night fell gradually, layering the hills in muted blues and silvers, stars emerging tentatively above. The village glowed faintly with hearth fires, a small constellation of human warmth within the encompassing darkness. Aragorn remained on the hill, eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow, mind attuned to the rhythms of both land and people. He reflected on the subtle costs of his existence, the persistent solitude, the constant vigilance, and the quiet tempering of ambition by necessity. These costs, though heavy, were the mechanisms through which discipline, judgment, and foresight were cultivated, and yet within them lay preparation for moments yet to come, when patience, understanding, and discernment would be the truest measures of strength. A cool wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of distant forests and the promise of journeys beyond sight. Aragorn rose, stretching briefly before settling his cloak and sword for rest. In this twilight, he sensed the slow accumulation of knowledge and endurance, the invisible shaping of character that would define him when the day arrived to step fully into destiny. The stars above seemed to affirm the principle, their quiet constancy, a reminder that even unseen forces, heritage, choice, and preparation shaped the course of the world. Tomorrow would bring movement, challenges, and further observation, yet tonight, in the hush of hills and forest, the life of Strider unfolded in the patient rhythm of duty, awareness, and reflection. Here, in the twilight between day and night, Aragorn allowed himself to settle, embracing the solitude as both companion and teacher. The forest, the village, and the hills around him were not merely a backdrop, but active participants in the shaping of the man he was becoming. Every shadow, every glimmer of light, every quiet breath of wind contributed to the curriculum of vigilance and discernment that would serve him when the time came to claim the mantle of kingship. And though he slept beneath the open sky, the threads of lineage, legacy, and responsibility wove steadily through his consciousness, knitting a pattern that would guide each step on the long winding road toward Gondor and the fulfillment of a destiny long whispered in the leaves and stones of the northern lands. The forest in the early morning held a subdued hush, as though it had been waiting for the arrival of footsteps not yet fully recognized. Aragorn moved through the undergrowth with the ease of one who had spent years attuning himself to the rhythm of the land, yet each step now carried an additional awareness. The world was no longer solely his to observe. Threads of other lives, other destinies, had begun to intersect with his own, and the gentle guidance of unseen forces whispered that the solitary path of the ranger would soon converge with companions whose presence, though fleeting, would leave an indelible mark upon his journey. The forest floor, littered with leaves and small stones, seemed to murmur of hidden meetings, subtle exchanges, and the quiet shaping of trust. Each movement, each pause, became a careful negotiation, an acknowledgement that his path was now intertwined with others, and that observation alone was insufficient without understanding the delicate currents of alliance and loyalty. As he rounded a bend, Aragorn's eyes caught the faint glimmer of someone moving silently among the trees. His hand rested lightly upon the hilt of his sword, not in anticipation of conflict, but in readiness to acknowledge presence without disturbance. The figure revealed itself, a man, cloaked and cautious, yet deliberate in movement. There was recognition in that shared stillness, a silent acknowledgement that each had been observing, assessing, measuring the other. In this brief encounter lay the first mechanism of alliance, mutual understanding, born of patience and discretion. Words were minimal, gestures subtle, yet a foundation was quietly laid. The costs of trust, he knew, were hidden and often delayed. Vulnerability, the possibility of betrayal, and the necessity of continued vigilance. But the potential gains were profound, shaping the networks that could stabilize or unravel entire regions. The man spoke, voice low and calm, and in his presence Aragorn detected a depth of knowledge tempered by restraint. He introduced himself as one who wandered much like Aragorn, yet carried experience and insight into the movements of men, the hidden currents of commerce, and the quiet machinations of distant rulers. In listening, Aragorn absorbed lessons not taught by forest or solitude, learning the subtle mechanisms that bind disparate actors into temporary or enduring coalitions. Here was an early example of the lattice through which influence traveled, a network of observation, discretion, and shared purpose that would later prove critical in orchestrating events of much greater consequence. The cost of such understanding was attention, unceasing, careful, and disciplined, and an awareness that appearances often concealed both motive and capacity. The morning stretched onward, with the forest alive in ways both seen and imperceptible. Aragorn and his companion moved through glades and along riverbanks, discussing matters in quiet tones that allowed the land itself to remain undisturbed. Words carried weight, but more significant were the silences, the pauses that permitted reflection and assessment. Each glance at the terrain, each measurement of distance and risk reinforced the principle that leadership, at its root, was a practice of awareness. The smallest oversight could ripple outward with consequences unnoticed until too late, and the ability to discern patterns beneath surface appearances was essential. Here, in conversation and observation, Aragorn began to understand the early lessons of fellowship, not merely companionship, but the weaving of skills, insight, and judgment into a network capable of responding to both seen and hidden threats. As the sun climbed higher, they arrived at a shallow clearing, where a stream forked among stones smoothed by centuries of water. Aragorn knelt, tracing a finger along the surface of a rock, noting the subtle signs of passage, footprints, bent branches, remnants of fires long extinguished. The companion observed quietly, offering gentle commentary on interpretation, on reading the traces of human presence as one reads the language of the world itself. Here was a mechanism of mastery, perception married to memory and inference, applied to the movements of men, and eventually armies, across a land that was neither forgiving nor indifferent. Costs were immediate. Attention demanded energy, reflection delayed action, and the act of understanding always carried the subtle risk of misjudgment. Yet the promise of foresight, the ability to anticipate consequence and influence events before they escalated, was a reward that few could measure or replicate. In these moments, Aragorn also recognized the early shape of moral testing, the choice to intervene or observe, to speak or remain silent, to trust or withhold confidence, all carried consequences that were simultaneously practical and ethical. These decisions were the quiet exercises of leadership, performed without fanfare, often unnoticed by those outside the circle of observation. The forest, with its shadows and open glades, provided both training and counsel, its rhythms echoing the deeper principles of restraint, patience, and foresight. He reflected on his own lineage and the vanished kingdom of Arnor, understanding that hidden authority, like these quiet pathways, could shape history without public acknowledgement. Knowledge, discretion, and moral clarity were as vital as any sword or shield, and the cultivation of these qualities was a task that demanded both patience and perseverance. Afternoon waned, and they approached the edge of a hill that overlooked a broad valley. Below, a village lay spread along the river bank, modest yet orderly, its fields and dwellings hinting at a society sustained by quiet diligence and careful cooperation. Aragorn observed from the shadows, noting the rhythms of labor, the distribution of responsibilities, and the subtle hierarchies that guided interaction. The mechanisms of governance, small but potent, were laid bare in these human patterns: mutual dependence, informal authority, and the quiet enforcement of norms. Costs were subtle yet profound. Each decision carried the potential to disrupt, each interaction to ripple outward, and each unheeded signal to invite disorder. In recognizing these patterns, Aragorn honed the ability to anticipate consequence, to evaluate character, and to prepare for intervention when the balance of stability might be threatened. As evening approached, the companion departed silently, leaving Aragorn to the contemplation of his own reflections. The encounter had illuminated the subtleties of alliance and fellowship, yet also emphasized the isolation inherent in his path. The formation of trust required patience and repeated observation. The cost was vigilance and measured restraint, yet the reward was a network capable of sustaining action in a world poised on the edge of disruption. Aragorn understood, even in this early stage, that his future interactions would require a similar balance: knowledge paired with discretion, foresight tempered by empathy, and the careful navigation of moral and practical responsibility. Each meeting, each gesture, each calculated risk was an investment in the unseen architecture of leadership. Night fell with a gentle authority, draping the valley and forest in deep indigo and silvered shadow. Stars pricked the sky with quiet constancy, their light diffused through the thin veil of high clouds. Aragorn settled on a rise overlooking the village, the distant sounds of life blending with the wind through pines. He reflected upon the day's lessons, the patterns of human movement, the mechanisms of trust and cooperation, the costs of discretion, and the subtle shaping of character through observation and moral attentiveness. The forest had taught him endurance and patience. The companion had taught him the value of reflection and alliance. Both were indispensable threads in the tapestry of preparation that would ultimately define his ability to lead and to reconcile the hidden legacies of Arnor with the practical realities of Gondor. Within the hush of twilight, he traced the distant lights of the village with his gaze, recognizing that even small communities were microcosms of larger kingdoms, their successes and failures bound by mechanisms both visible and hidden. Here was an early lesson in subtle stewardship. Leadership began with observation, continued through understanding, and culminated in action informed by knowledge, empathy, and discretion. The costs were quiet, yet cumulative, shaping character over time, while the rewards were profound, preparing one to act when the threads of circumstance demanded intervention. Aragorn felt the resonance of lineage and purpose in these observations, sensing that the journey he undertook was both inward and outward, personal and collective, immediate and far-reaching. As the night deepened, a gentle wind carried whispers of distant forests and unseen passes, hints of journeys yet to come. Aragorn allowed himself a moment to breathe, to align the rhythms of his body with the cadence of the land and the quiet pulse of emerging destiny. He recognized the duality of his existence, the need for vigilance and the inevitability of fellowship, the intertwining of solitude and alliance, and the delicate balance between knowledge and action. Each choice, each observation, each quiet decision contributed to the shaping of a life that would one day influence kingdoms. Yet he remained, for now, Strider, a silent observer, a careful participant, and a learner in the vast classroom of Middle-earth, attuned to the subtleties that would guide him toward a future yet unseen. In the soft indigo of night, with stars flickering faintly overhead and the village lights winking like distant echoes, Aragorn allowed the lessons of the day to settle within him. The mechanisms of alliance, the subtle art of trust, and the quiet shaping of fellowship were now tangible, forming a lattice upon which his future actions would rest. He felt, with serene awareness, the gentle pressure of destiny, the invisible hand of lineage, and the moral weight of emerging authority. Tomorrow, the journey would continue, and the threads woven today would inevitably guide the encounters, choices, and subtle maneuvers that lay ahead. In this night of quiet reflection, the life of Strider continued its deliberate, patient unfolding, preparing the ranger to become not only a guardian of the North, but a figure whose influence would quietly shape the destiny of Gondor itself. Morning unfolded over the northern hills, with a gentle haze, the sunlight sifting through mist and trees in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Aragorn rose from his resting place beside the river, feeling the residual weight of the previous day's observation and reflection, yet also the steady pulse of readiness that came from disciplined vigilance. He moved with quiet assurance along the banks, noting the subtle interactions of wildlife, the way the river traced its course through rocks and soil, and the faint signs of human passage from the settlements below. Each detail mattered, for the mastery of observation was a mechanism not simply of survival, but of preparation for larger responsibilities. Today, his path would take him closer to the political currents that flowed beneath Gondor's northern borderlands, the subtle manipulations of influence that shaped loyalty and behavior without visible force. Aragorn understood that the world's true structures were often hidden, discernible only to those who watched patiently, considered carefully, and interpreted with steady judgment. As he ascended a ridge overlooking the valley, Aragorn noticed a small encampment tucked into the forest's edge, smoke rising in thin, deliberate columns from carefully tended fires. The placement of the camp suggested strategy and purpose, proximity to the road without immediate exposure, visibility of the surrounding terrain, and subtle indications of monitoring. The mechanisms at work were both practical and psychological, designed to assert presence, gather intelligence, and impose caution upon those passing nearby. Aragorn moved cautiously, observing the occupants with disciplined attention, noting posture, interaction, and the rhythm of labor and rest. Each movement, each glance, was a breadcrumb in a larger pattern that, if followed with patience and clarity, could reveal intention, capability, and potential vulnerabilities. He understood that costs were embedded in vigilance, energy expended, attention diverted, and the quiet tension of concealed observation. Yet the benefits, foresight, preparedness, and insight into the structure of human action were immeasurable. From a shaded vantage, Aragorn watched as the figures in the camp conducted their routines, carrying water, arranging supplies, and exchanging muted words. Leadership within the group was subtle but evident. A nod, a gesture, or the alignment of a task revealed hierarchy without overt assertion. Aragorn traced the flow of influence, noting how authority was communicated not only through speech, but through posture, movement, and the careful modulation of attention. These observations reinforced earlier lessons. Governance, whether of small groups or kingdoms, depended on patterns of interaction as much as formal mandate. And understanding these patterns allowed the skilled observer to anticipate consequence and shape events with precision. The cost of ignorance, conversely, was subtle yet profound. Misjudgment in hierarchy, misreading of intent, or underestimation of capacity could create vulnerability, misalign response, and compound risk. Aragorn absorbed these lessons with quiet focus, recognizing their application to larger structures in Gondor's governance and defense. He shifted his position to track a narrow trail that led from the camp toward the main road, noting the deliberate care with which the travelers maintained distance and spacing. Each detail revealed the mechanisms of coordination. The led figure adjusted pace to maintain control. The rear maintained surveillance of their passage, and subtle signals communicated changes in posture or direction. Aragorn interpreted these patterns as a lattice of influence and discipline, understanding how small adjustments could cascade into broader consequences. The cost of failure in such coordination was clear. Gaps could be exploited, information could be lost, and unintended exposure could compromise both safety and purpose. Yet mastery of observation allowed anticipation, mitigation, and, when necessary, subtle intervention to steer outcomes without direct confrontation. These were lessons of foresight and strategy, of timing and restraint, preparing him for engagements in which strength alone would be insufficient. By midday, the patrol from the camp intersected with a small convoy of merchants traveling from the settlements, their carts loaded with produce and provisions. Aragorn noted the subtle tension in posture, the modulation of conversation, and the careful compliance with the patrol's expectations. Influence was exercised quietly, through positioning, presence, and the implied authority of numbers and readiness, rather than overt force. The mechanisms were delicate yet potent, shaping behavior and routing movement without overt conflict. Aragorn considered the broader implications. In Gondor, as in these minor interactions, stability was maintained by networks of observation, the careful alignment of authority, and the anticipatory modulation of consequence. The costs were subtle yet real, affecting trust, morale, and long-term cohesion, and failure to understand these dynamics could unravel even the most resilient system. As he followed the patrol from a safe distance, Aragorn traced their patterns across the valley and along the river's edge, noting how human behavior adapted to terrain, social hierarchy, and environmental cues. Each adjustment revealed not only intent, but also the mechanisms of influence, the costs of compliance, and the subtleties of leverage. He recognized the lessons for larger-scale governance. Vigilance was not only a matter of force, but also of perception. Authority was maintained through consistency, subtle reinforcement, and strategic positioning. And understanding consequence required patience, reflection, and disciplined attention. In these minor interactions, the foundational principles of stewardship and leadership became tangible, illustrating how control and influence could be maintained without overt assertion, and how the quiet orchestration of patterns could shape outcomes far beyond immediate perception. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the hills, and Aragorn moved toward a narrow ridge overlooking the patrol's end point, a small bridge crossing the river where the road funneled movement. From this vantage, he observed the broader structure of the region: settlements, patrols, paths, and fields arranged in a pattern of interdependent mechanisms. The soldiers' actions were framed not only by their immediate orders, but by the constraints imposed by geography, social expectation, and long-standing patterns of interaction. Aragorn recognized that this understanding of interrelation, how small structures supported larger networks, was central to the preparation of Gondor's recovery. The costs of neglect were visible in minor inefficiencies, fatigue, and miscommunication, while the benefits of careful anticipation were embedded in stability, resilience, and the capacity to guide action with minimal disruption. He spent hours observing, noting minutiae that might otherwise escape attention: the spacing between patrol members, the timing of their signals, the rhythm of merchant compliance, and the subtle shifts in posture that indicated vigilance or fatigue. These patterns, though modest, revealed larger truths about coordination, influence, and the interplay of authority and responsibility. Aragorn reflected on the broader implications, understanding the structures of behavior, the mechanisms of control, and the costs of both engagement and restraint were foundational to the exercise of power and the preservation of stability. Leadership was not declared by sword alone. It was discerned through pattern, anticipation, and the measured application of insight. As evening approached, the patrol returned to its encampment, moving with deliberate care, and Aragorn allowed himself to descend toward the river's edge. Here, in solitude, he reflected upon the lessons embedded in the day's observations: the flow of authority, the coordination of action, the management of perception, and the anticipation of consequence. Each encounter reinforced a principle critical to his emerging understanding of leadership. Influence is often quiet, consequence often delayed, and mastery requires patient attention to both visible and hidden dynamics. The costs of oversight, misinterpretation, and inaction were subtle yet cumulative, while the rewards of discernment, foresight, and strategic engagement were profound and enduring. Night fell with a gentle inevitability, the sky deepening to a rich indigo, and Aragorn settled near the river bank, listening to the water's steady flow. His thoughts traced the movements of the patrol, the positioning of settlements, and the subtle patterns that shaped human behavior across the region. He understood that these small interactions were microcosms of larger principles: the orchestration of stability through observation and influence, the management of consequence through strategic attention, and the cultivation of authority through subtle demonstration rather than overt assertion. In this reflective stillness, he acknowledged the hidden structures that governed both men and land, recognizing that mastery of these mechanisms would be essential to the reclamation of Gondor's legacy. He traced the river's path through moonlight, observing the interplay of terrain and human adaptation, noting the resilience of structures, the placement of dwellings, and the faint signs of vigilance embedded in every settlement. These details, seemingly minor, formed a lattice of understanding that prepared him for larger challenges ahead. Leadership, he reflected, required the patient accumulation of insight, the quiet observation of mechanism, and the careful assessment of cost and consequence. Each subtle movement, each whispered instruction, each shadow of intent was a lesson in governance, influence, and responsibility. As night deepened, Aragorn allowed the forest and river to enfold him, attuning his senses to the rhythm of the land. The patrol's presence, the patterns of settlement, and the echoes of historical legacy coalesced into a coherent understanding. Preparation and foresight, grounded in careful observation, were indispensable. The costs of error were hidden yet potent, capable of undermining authority and destabilizing regions, while the quiet exercise of insight allowed the guiding hand to shape events with subtlety and precision. Aragorn embraced this understanding, allowing it to settle into the rhythm of his thoughts, preparing both mind and body for the convergence of events that would demand action, judgment, and the careful orchestration of alliances. In the faint luminescence of stars, he reflected upon lineage, responsibility, and the subtle mechanisms of influence that governed the northern lands. Each observation, each interaction, and each consideration of consequence had prepared him for the responsibilities awaiting in Gondor. Solitude had honed vigilance, reflection had cultivated judgment, and observation had revealed the intricate lattice of human behavior and environmental influence. These lessons, both practical and philosophical, would inform his decisions, shape his alliances, and provide the foundation for leadership tempered by foresight, empathy, and restraint. As the river murmured beneath moonlight and the distant villages lay quietly, Aragorn allowed himself to rest, attuned to the rhythm of the night and the steady pulse of preparation. The mechanisms of human interaction, the costs of oversight, and the potential for subtle influence coalesced in his understanding, providing both clarity and patience for the days ahead. Leadership, he knew, was cultivated long before coronation, in observation, reflection, and disciplined anticipation, and the quiet mastery of these principles would ultimately guide him toward the reclamation of Gondor's legacy. The morning light filtered through the branches in soft, irregular shafts, casting dappled patterns across the forest floor. Aragorn moved deliberately along a narrow track, the echoes of previous days' observation still alive in his mind, shaping his rhythm and perception. The river to his left murmured gently, a constant reminder of the land's enduring pulse and the silent mechanisms that guided both nature and human settlement. He noted every subtle shift, the tension in a bird's wing, the faint indentation in the soil, the distant flash of movement that might signal life or threat. Each detail was a thread in a broader weave, and his understanding of these threads was becoming as vital as his awareness of his own physical path. Gondor's northern frontier was a living system, fragile and intricate, and Aragorn's careful attention allowed him to perceive not only what was, but what could be, and the costs implicit in every action or inaction. Today's journey carried him into a more undulating terrain, where ridges rose and fell with the measured rhythm of ancient earth. The settlements were smaller here, more scattered, and the presence of the patrols from previous days became evident in subtle signs, footprints along trails, faint smoke trails marking temporary encampments, and the occasional glint of a blade in sunlight. Aragorn moved with patience, allowing these indicators to inform both his path and his understanding. Each movement revealed a network of coordination and hierarchy, a delicate orchestration of authority and vigilance. He understood the mechanisms at work. Patrols exerted influence, not only through visible presence, but through anticipation, expectation, and the quiet management of perception. The cost of miscalculation was woven into the fabric of each interaction. Fatigue, exposure, distrust, or unintended escalation could ripple outward, destabilizing both local settlements and the broader patterns of human behavior. Aragorn absorbed these lessons silently, his mind cataloging consequence alongside observation, preparing for engagement at scales both immediate and systemic. By mid-morning, he approached a small clearing where the remnants of an older road intersected the path he followed. Here, the traces of history were evident, the stones of a collapsed bridge, the carved timbers of an abandoned waypoint, and the faint impressions of ancient wheel ruts embedded in the earth. Aragorn paused, running his hand along a moss-covered stone, tracing the lines of labor and intention that had once shaped passage. The mechanisms of travel, trade, and communication were evident even in ruins. Their cost was clear in decay, disuse, and the slow erosion of human effort. Yet their function, though silent, persisted in the landscape, revealing the enduring influence of design and the necessity of maintenance, oversight, and attentiveness. Aragorn understood, with quiet clarity, that leadership was inseparable from stewardship. The orchestration of both action and preservation, the careful calibration of consequence, and the acknowledgement of costs hidden from immediate view. As the afternoon sun reached its zenith, Aragorn entered a narrow valley, its walls steep and shadowed, the river carving its path at the bottom. Small settlements dotted the edges, and he observed the residents engaged in routine labor, tending crops, repairing structures, and moving along paths designed for efficiency and safety. These settlements were modest yet resilient, their layout revealing adaptation to both terrain and the presence of patrols. Aragorn noted the mechanisms of trust and authority embedded in these patterns, communal labor reinforcing hierarchy, the positioning of homes for observation and protection, and the subtle cues of mutual accountability. The cost of disruption, whether from neglect, conflict, or mismanagement, was evident in the erosion of cohesion, the vulnerability of isolated dwellings, and the faint anxiety carried in the posture of laborers. Aragorn's observations were both analytic and empathetic, mapping consequence alongside human resilience, and preparing him to engage not with force, but with insight. He paused near a wooden bridge spanning a narrow creek, allowing the gentle flow of water and the filtered sunlight to anchor his reflection. In these moments of quiet, he considered the broader patterns of Gondor's northern borderlands, the interplay of terrain, settlement, patrol, and governance, the consequences of attention and inattention, and the subtle mechanisms by which stability and influence were exercised. Each patrol, each path, each dwelling was a node in a lattice of authority, and understanding this lattice was as crucial as understanding the river's flow or the forest's growth. Aragorn felt the weight of lineage and responsibility pressing gently, guiding attention, shaping reflection, and reinforcing the principle that kingship was earned through mastery of observation, patience, and careful orchestration of consequence. Later, as he continued along the valley floor, he encountered a small encampment of rangers from the north, men with experience etched into posture and gesture, eyes trained to discern movement and nuance. They regarded him with a mixture of recognition and cautious curiosity, understanding instinctively that he was neither ordinary traveler nor threat. Words were exchanged sparingly, the conversation a careful exchange of information, strategy, and assessment. Aragorn absorbed their observations, noting patterns in movement, vigilance, and coordination, integrating these insights into the broader understanding he was accumulating of Gondor's northern landscape. Each interaction revealed the mechanisms of trust and authority, the subtle costs of misalignment, and the potential for quiet influence without overt assertion. Leadership, he reflected, was never only about command. It was a careful negotiation of expectation, capacity, and consequence. By late afternoon, Aragorn found himself atop a ridge overlooking a narrow pass, the sun angling low and casting long shadows across the hills. The view offered both a strategic perspective and a contemplative pause, revealing the interwoven patterns of settlement, patrol, and terrain in a single, expansive tableau. The river below traced a winding path through fields and forests, reflecting the sky's pale light, and settlements clustered at crossings, forming nodes of human activity shaped by geography and necessity. Aragorn considered the mechanisms at work: observation, influence, anticipation, and restraint, all converging to sustain the fragile equilibrium of the region. Costs were apparent in weariness, misjudgment, and the tension inherent in vigilance, yet the benefits of comprehension and foresight were enduring, allowing one to shape outcomes with subtlety and precision. He began his descent toward a cluster of cottages nestled along the riverbank, the smoke from chimneys curling lazily into the sky. The residents moved with quiet purpose, performing routines honed over generations, balancing efficiency, security, and communal cohesion. Aragorn observed without interference, noting the invisible patterns that structured their lives: lines of sight for surveillance, shared responsibilities reinforcing cohesion, and the modulation of behavior in response to nearby patrols. These subtle mechanisms, though largely unseen, maintained stability and resilience. He understood that recognition of such patterns, anticipation of consequence, and the careful calibration of intervention were essential skills for leadership and stewardship, lessons reinforced in both observation and reflection. Evening arrived slowly, bathing the valley in shades of violet and silver, and Aragorn found a quiet place near the river to rest. The day's journey had revealed not only the patterns of terrain and settlement, but the subtle orchestration of authority and influence that governed the northern lands. Leadership, he reflected, was as much a matter of understanding consequence as it was of asserting will. It was exercised through observation, patience, and discernment rather than through force alone. The costs of neglect or misjudgment were rarely immediate, but persisted quietly, shaping outcomes in ways both visible and hidden. Aragorn allowed these lessons to settle within him, forming a lattice of understanding that would guide decisions, actions, and alliances in the days to come. As night deepened, the river's gentle murmur accompanied his reflection, a steady rhythm that grounded thought and attention. Aragorn traced the patterns of the day, noting the flow of movement, the subtle exercises of authority, and the invisible costs and benefits embedded in human behavior. He felt the quiet weight of responsibility, not as burden alone, but as a guiding force, shaping both perception and action. The northern borderlands of Gondor were a living system, intricate and delicate, and mastery required sustained attention, disciplined observation, and thoughtful intervention. Aragorn embraced this understanding, allowing it to settle into the rhythm of the night, attuning mind and body to the quiet mechanisms that would inform his path toward Gondor's restoration. In the soft luminescence of moonlight, he reflected on lineage, consequence, and the subtle structures of authority that governed both land and people. Each observation, each encounter, and each consideration of cost and outcome had contributed to a growing lattice of comprehension, one that would inform his decisions and actions when the convergence of events demanded leadership. Solitude, observation, and reflection had prepared him for this understanding, teaching that influence often lay in quiet orchestration rather than visible command, that consequence unfolded slowly and cumulatively, and that patience and insight were the foundations of enduring stewardship. Finally, as the stars multiplied in the indigo sky, and the river shimmered faintly in silver light, Aragorn allowed himself a measured pause. The lessons of the day, embedded in terrain, settlement, and human behavior, formed a coherent structure of insight and preparation. Leadership, he recognized, was cultivated through patient attention to mechanism, careful assessment of consequence, and the subtle exercise of influence, and the quiet mastery of these principles would prepare him for the convergence of events that lay ahead. The northern hills whispered their lessons in stone, river, and forest, and Aragorn, attuned to their rhythms, felt the pulse of preparation align with the inheritance of legacy, guiding him step by deliberate step toward the reclamation of Gondor's destiny. The forest awoke with a muted serenity, sunlight threading its way through high branches and dappling the ground in shifting patterns of gold and green. Aragorn moved with deliberate quiet, each step absorbing the subtle language of the land, the bent reed signaling passage, the faint scent of animals marking territory, the whisper of wind through leaves hinting at distant movement. In these moments, the world revealed its mechanisms to the patient observer, and Aragorn's senses, honed through years of wandering and reflection, discerned both detail and pattern with unwavering attention. The northern hills of Gondor were more than geography. They were a living archive of history, stewardship, and consequence. Each ridge and river bend a record of the choices and efforts of those who had come before. Today, his path carried him toward signs of human tension, the delicate dance of influence and vigilance that governed settlements at the edge of the realm. He descended toward a narrow stream, its water glinting faintly in the morning light, carrying with it the scent of earth and moss. The settlements ahead were small and irregularly placed, their modest structures suggesting adaptation to both terrain and social constraint. Aragorn paused to observe, noting the quiet choreography of daily life. A child's careful passage along a plank, a farmer adjusting tools to the angle of sun and shadow, a gate slightly ajar that implied a pattern of trust and oversight. Each motion, each subtle choice, was part of a larger mechanism, a lattice that maintained equilibrium in a region where human attention and environmental factors were inseparable. The cost of misalignment, he knew, was subtle yet consequential. Hesitation, vulnerability, and the erosion of trust and stability, consequences that compounded silently but inexorably. Aragorn catalogued these lessons, letting observation precede engagement, reflection prepare response, and foresight guide each choice. By mid-morning, he spotted a patrol moving along the high ridge above the settlements, their discipline and coordination evident even at a distance. The leader's gestures were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet each command was obeyed instantly, demonstrating the mechanisms of hierarchy and obedience without overt enforcement. Aragorn traced the flow of influence, noting the spacing, posture, and cadence of movement, understanding the ways in which control was maintained through anticipation and adjustment rather than confrontation. The cost of this exertion was visible in the slight stiffness of limbs, the concentrated attention etched in eyes, and the unspoken tension that guided each step. Yet these small exertions preserved order, prevented conflict, and maintained the invisible scaffolding of governance that supported both settlements and broader territorial control. Aragorn's reflection upon these structures deepened his understanding of the responsibilities that lay ahead, reinforcing the principle that leadership required patience, perception, and strategic foresight as much as courage and skill. He followed the patrol's course from a shaded grove, careful to remain undetected, and observed how they interacted with the terrain. The path was narrow, bordered by rock and forest, and the soldiers adapted continually, adjusting pace, spacing, and awareness to the landscape. Each movement was an exercise in practical influence, exerted quietly, its consequences unfolding subtly yet reliably. Aragorn noted these mechanisms, recognizing that leadership depended upon similar adaptation, comprehension of constraint, anticipation of consequence, and the careful modulation of action to preserve stability. The cost of error was clear. Misjudged terrain, misaligned attention, or misread signals could disrupt order and invite vulnerability. But mastery of these principles allowed preparation and subtle guidance rather than reactive intervention. Observation, he understood, was the first instrument of leadership. Foresight was its reinforcement. By afternoon, the patrol had reached a minor crossroads where merchants and travelers often intersected, and Aragorn observed the interplay between the movement of goods, the exercise of authority, and the responses of those governed by subtle influence. Carts slowed, riders adjusted posture, and traders followed unspoken rules of spacing and attention, yielding to authority without overt coercion. These mechanisms, though modest, revealed the principles of governance at a microcosmic level. Influence applied through visibility, expectation, and subtle signaling could direct behavior with minimal disruption. Aragorn reflected on the broader implications. Gondor's northern frontier required understanding not only of military strength, but of communication, perception, and the invisible scaffolding of control. Costs, though imperceptible in the moment, accumulated in fatigue, hesitation, and the erosion of trust, yet the careful orchestration of attention and influence ensured continuity and resilience. He descended further, to a small encampment at the edge of the river, where he noted the precise arrangement of tents, supplies, and watch points. The patrol's presence had imposed structure and subtle regulation upon the inhabitants, and Aragorn observed how these mechanisms extended influence quietly, shaping the environment and its occupants without overt assertion. Leadership, he reflected, was exercised in the measured alignment of environment, expectation, and human response. The costs of oversight or misjudgment were latent yet potent, while the rewards of insight, patience, and disciplined observation were profound, allowing the skilled practitioner to guide outcomes with precision and subtlety. Aragorn catalogued these lessons, understanding that every action, every placement, and every choice carried potential consequence beyond immediate perception. Later in the afternoon, he encountered a ranger from the north, stationed at a high vantage point to observe both the valley and the road beyond. Words were exchanged sparingly, the conversation careful, deliberate, and measured, focusing on observation, pattern, and the distribution of attention across space and time. Aragorn listened, integrated information, and reflected upon the subtle costs of vigilance, physical wear, psychological strain, and the cumulative weight of responsibility. He also noted the advantages: foresight, strategic leverage, and the quiet capacity to shape movement, expectation, and consequence across a network of settlements and patrols. These lessons reinforced the principles that had guided him for days. Patience, observation, and disciplined attention were the instruments of leadership, capable of shaping human and environmental mechanisms without overt confrontation. As evening approached, the valley below deepened into shadow, and the river shimmered faintly in the waning light. Aragorn settled in a concealed position near the forest's edge, allowing reflection to merge with observation. He traced the movements of patrols, settlements, and travelers, recognizing the interplay of human intention, environmental constraint, and consequence. Authority was exercised quietly, influence exerted subtly, and costs accrued incrementally, often hidden but enduring. In these quiet exercises of perception and reflection, Aragorn reinforced the principles of stewardship he had internalized: attention to mechanism, anticipation of consequence, and the careful calibration of engagement. Leadership required mastery of both what was visible and what lay beneath the surface, a balance of patience, insight, and discrete action that shaped outcomes over time. Nightfall brought a reflective stillness, the river murmuring beneath moonlight and stars gleaming faintly above. Aragorn allowed the rhythm of the land to guide his thoughts, tracing patterns of movement, influence, and consequence through the northern frontier. Each interaction, each adjustment, each silent exertion of authority became a lesson in governance and foresight. The cost of misjudgment was always present but deferred, while the benefit of patient observation and strategic anticipation provided a steady foundation for future action. Aragorn's awareness encompassed both immediate and extended networks, recognizing the interdependence of terrain, settlement, patrol, and consequence. In this lattice of comprehension, he found a quiet sense of alignment, a foundation for the decisions and interventions that would eventually demand both courage and discretion. He allowed the sounds of the night, the river, the rustle of leaves, and the distant murmur of settlement life, to anchor his reflection. The subtle interplay of human behavior, environmental constraint, and authority formed a complex lattice, requiring careful attention to discern and navigate. Aragorn considered the broader implications. Leadership was cultivated not in overt displays of power, but in patient observation, reflection, and the strategic modulation of consequence. The cost of oversight or misjudgment might not manifest immediately, yet it accumulated imperceptibly, shaping outcomes in ways both subtle and enduring. The mastery of these mechanisms provided insight, leverage, and resilience, equipping him to act decisively when circumstances required intervention. As he prepared to rest for the night, Aragorn reflected upon lineage, responsibility, and the structures of influence that governed both land and people. Each observation of patrol, settlement, and natural feature had contributed to a growing understanding of interdependence, consequence, and authority. The lessons of patient observation, careful anticipation, and measured engagement had solidified into a lattice of comprehension, one that would guide his choices and actions in the days ahead. Solitude, reflection, and quiet attention had prepared him for the responsibilities that awaited, teaching that influence was most potent when exercised subtly, that foresight shaped outcome more than immediate action, and that enduring stewardship required both discernment and restraint. Finally, as the valley settled into night, the stars mirrored faintly upon the river's surface, and Aragorn allowed himself a moment of stillness. The patterns of human behavior, the rhythms of the land, and the quiet exertions of authority coalesced into a coherent understanding. Leadership was not merely the assertion of will, but the careful orchestration of influence, observation, and consequence. Aragorn embraced this realization, feeling the steady pulse of preparation within him, attuned to both land and lineage, readying himself for the convergence of events that would demand judgment, discretion, and decisive action. The northern frontier of Gondor whispered its lessons in stone, river, and forest, and Aragorn, listening with intent and patience, felt the alignment of readiness with destiny, each step deliberate, each observation purposeful, guiding him toward the reclamation of his legacy and the quiet assertion of stewardship that would define his path forward. The dawn broke slowly over the hills, a soft, pale light filtering through mist that clung to the valleys like a delicate veil. Aragorn stirred beneath the canopy of ancient trees, the cool morning air carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. The river murmured gently in the distance, its steady cadence a reminder of time's quiet passage and the persistent flow of consequence across the northern lands. Rising carefully, Aragorn traced the subtle signs left by both nature and human endeavor: bent reeds, footpaths pressed into soil, and faint marks on bark that spoke of passage, vigilance, and observation. These were not merely details to the trained eye. They were mechanisms, indicators of hidden structures that governed behavior and consequence. In understanding them, Aragorn attuned himself not only to the land, but to the unseen lattice of authority and influence that shaped every interaction, every choice, and every ripple of action across the settlements he had observed. He moved along a narrow ridge overlooking a patchwork of fields and hamlets, each cluster of cottages positioned with quiet deliberation, aligning sightlines, access to water, and proximity to patrol paths. Aragorn paused to consider the subtle orchestration at play. The placement of dwellings reinforced communal cohesion, encouraged mutual vigilance, and allowed authority to extend its reach without overt intervention. These mechanisms were small yet potent, shaping behavior and expectation through arrangement, observation, and the cumulative weight of minor actions. The costs, though subtle, were ever present: fatigue, tension, and the slow accumulation of responsibility pressed upon those who maintained vigilance, while lapses could have consequences far beyond immediate perception. Aragorn's attention catalogued both cause and effect, noting how the interplay of pattern, terrain, and human decision created a living system that demanded patience, foresight, and disciplined insight to navigate effectively. By mid-morning, he descended toward a shallow valley, where a minor road wound its way past fields and orchards, the occasional smoke rising from chimneys marking both domestic labor and quiet presence. Here, human activity and environmental rhythm converged in a tableau of subtle governance. The spacing of trees, the alignment of fences, and the flow of water channels indicated careful attention to both utility and observation. Aragorn followed the road at a measured distance, noting travelers' postures, responses to passing patrols, and the modulation of speech and gesture as social signals. Influence was exercised continuously, though imperceptibly, through presence, expectation, and the calibration of behavior. And Aragorn reflected on the parallels between these microcosmic interactions and the larger principles that guided leadership across Gondor. Costs were embedded in effort and attention, the mental and physical demands of vigilance quietly accumulating, while the benefits, foresight, resilience, and control were equally subtle yet enduring. As noon approached, he came upon a cluster of rangers stationed at a narrow ridge, observing both the road and the surrounding hills. Their coordination was precise. Each movement, glance, and gesture reinforced hierarchy and maintained oversight without direct imposition. Aragorn approached cautiously, acknowledging their presence with restrained gesture and soft speech. Conversation followed, careful and deliberate, sharing observations, patterns of movement, and subtle warnings about the valley's currents of influence. Aragorn absorbed their insights, noting the interplay between terrain, human response, and the exercise of quiet authority. These rangers embodied mechanisms of control that extended beyond immediate action, operating through observation, anticipation, and disciplined presence. He understood that leadership often functioned through these channels, shaping consequence and behavior without overt assertion, and that mastery required recognition of both seen and unseen costs, fatigue, misjudgment, and the slow accrual of tension. By mid-afternoon, Aragorn had moved further along the road, entering a small settlement nestled at the convergence of two streams. The residents moved with a quiet rhythm, performing tasks that balanced labor, vigilance, and community cohesion. He observed the subtle ways in which influence was exercised: positioning of homes and watch points, rotation of labor, and the careful alignment of paths that maintained both efficiency and surveillance. Authority was present not as command, but as structure, expectation, and habitual practice. Each detail, from the placement of a cart to the spacing of a gate, reflected an understanding of mechanism and consequence. Aragorn traced these patterns with patience, acknowledging the costs embedded in oversight and coordination, the strain on bodies, the vigilance demanded of minds, and the quiet, cumulative weight of responsibility, while appreciating the enduring benefits, stability, resilience, and the capacity to guide behavior with subtlety and precision. He paused at the edge of the settlement, looking back toward the ridge where he had observed the rangers. The network of influence, though invisible to most, revealed itself in movement, spacing, and posture. He considered the broader implications. The northern frontier of Gondor depended not only on physical strength, but on the careful orchestration of attention, perception, and expectation. Costs were latent, sometimes imperceptible, yet their accumulation could destabilize both people and territory, while disciplined engagement produced leverage, resilience, and the capacity to anticipate consequence before it became urgent. Aragorn allowed these reflections to merge with his observations, forming a lattice of comprehension that would inform decisions, actions, and interventions when circumstances demanded. Later in the afternoon, he followed a minor tributary of the main river, noting how the water shaped both the terrain and human adaptation. Bridges and fords had been placed with careful consideration, integrating both necessity and observation. He traced the placement of dwellings, fields, and patrol paths, understanding how each functioned within a broader system of governance, vigilance, and consequence. Here, as in previous encounters, influence extended through subtle mechanisms, the alignment of labor, the modulation of attention, and the anticipation of response. Aragorn reflected on the costs embedded in these interactions: physical strain, cumulative fatigue, and the quiet tension of responsibility. Yet the benefits, foresight, stability, and the ability to shape outcomes without overt confrontation were profound and enduring, reinforcing the principles of patient observation and measured engagement. As evening approached, Aragorn ascended a gentle rise, the valley below awash in the fading light, casting long, soft shadows that emphasized contours and distances. The settlements, patrols, and natural features coalesced into a coherent system, a living map of interaction, influence, and consequence. He observed the rhythm of human behavior, the careful pacing of patrols, the measured coordination of labor, and the subtle adjustments in posture and movement that communicated hierarchy, expectation, and attention. Each of these mechanisms revealed the cost of oversight and the value of anticipation. Aragorn considered the broader implications. Stewardship required more than courage. It demanded insight, patience, and the disciplined modulation of consequence. Leadership, he understood, was cultivated in observation, reflection, and the strategic exercise of influence, rather than in immediate assertion of force. Night descended gradually, the sky shifting through tones of deep blue and violet as the first stars became visible. Aragorn settled near the river, allowing its gentle murmur to anchor reflection. The patterns of settlement, patrol, and terrain formed a lattice of comprehension, teaching lessons of authority, anticipation, and subtle influence. He noted how human behavior adapted to expectation, geography, and the unseen weight of oversight. The costs of error, though deferred, were tangible. Fatigue, misjudgment, and the erosion of cohesion, each carrying consequences beyond immediate perception. Conversely, the benefits of disciplined observation, insight, and strategic engagement provided leverage, resilience, and a steady foundation for decisive action when necessary. Aragorn allowed these reflections to deepen into a quiet understanding of responsibility, consequence, and the subtle orchestration required of leadership. In the stillness of night, he traced the river's path beneath moonlight, observing how it shaped both terrain and human activity. Each settlement and patrol point revealed the mechanisms of coordination, influence, and expectation, each quietly enforcing stability and order. Aragorn contemplated lineage, stewardship, and the cumulative effect of minor choices upon larger structures. Leadership, he recognized, was enacted through patient observation, disciplined attention, and the subtle alignment of consequence. The northern lands of Gondor whispered their lessons, teaching him the enduring value of foresight, the hidden cost of misjudgment, and the quiet power of insight applied judiciously. He allowed the gentle sounds of the night, the river, the rustle of leaves, and distant animal movement, to anchor thought and reflection. Each detail, from the bending of a branch to the spacing of a settlement, contributed to a lattice of understanding that informed both present decisions and future action. Aragorn understood that leadership was not simply the exercise of authority, but the cultivation of perception, the patient orchestration of influence, and the careful consideration of consequence. The cost of neglect, whether immediate or deferred, could ripple outward imperceptibly. Yet the rewards of disciplined engagement and measured intervention were enduring and far-reaching. As the stars multiplied overhead, reflecting faintly upon the river, Aragorn permitted a moment of quiet stillness, absorbing the lessons of the day and the rhythms of the land. The subtle mechanisms of influence, the interplay of human behavior, and the calibration of consequence formed a coherent framework that would guide his future actions. Each observation, reflection, and insight deepened his understanding of leadership, revealing the interdependence of terrain, settlement, patrol, and authority. The northern frontier of Gondor, with its complex lattice of interaction and consequence, had become both classroom and guide, offering instruction in patience, discernment, and the measured application of insight. Finally, as night settled fully over the hills and the river glimmered faintly in silver moonlight, Aragorn allowed himself to rest, attuned to the rhythms of both land and lineage, the patterns of human behavior, the subtleties of influence, and the quiet exertions of authority coalesced into a living framework of understanding. Leadership, he realized, was cultivated through patient observation, disciplined reflection, and the careful orchestration of consequence, and the mastery of these principles would prepare him for the challenges and decisions that lay ahead. The northern lands whispered their enduring truths, and Aragorn, listening with attentive patience, felt the alignment of insight, preparation, and destiny, guiding each step toward the reclamation of Gondor's legacy, and the quiet assertion of stewardship that would define his path forward. The first light of dawn filtered through the morning mist, softening the contours of the hills and lending a silvered haze to the river that wound quietly through the valley. Aragorn rose from his concealed resting place near the river bank, each movement deliberate, as if attuning himself to the rhythm of the world around him. The night had offered reflection, but the day promised insight through observation and engagement, a continuation of the lessons embedded in terrain, settlement, and human pattern. He moved with quiet precision, sensing not only the immediate presence of the forest and the river, but the cumulative weight of history that lay upon the northern lands of Gondor. The choices of ancestors, the labor of caretakers, and the subtle interplay of vigilance, influence, and consequence across the centuries. Each step, each breath, and each pause was a thread in a larger fabric, a practice in patience, observation, and discernment that would shape both understanding and future action. The path led him along a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below, a mosaic of fields, cottages, and watchposts. From this vantage, the orchestration of settlements and patrols was evident, homes aligned with sightlines, minor roads intersecting in a controlled pattern, and subtle placements of labor and watchpoints, creating a lattice of influence that regulated both movement and expectation. Aragorn studied the interplay carefully, noting how each pattern reinforced cohesion and projected authority without overt assertion. The mechanisms of order were delicate yet resilient, dependent on the continuous attention of those who understood the balance between action and consequence. Costs were embedded silently within this system. Fatigue, tension, and the persistent pressure of vigilance weighed upon both individuals and communities, accumulating imperceptibly but profoundly, while the benefits, stability, foresight, and strategic leverage pervaded quietly, shaping outcomes over time. By mid-morning, he descended into a narrow glen where a minor road wound through cultivated fields, its edges marked by low fences and occasional stone markers. Farmers and laborers moved with habitual care, adjusting their tasks according to both sunlight and the presence of patrols. Aragorn noted the subtle choreography, the modulation of movement, the adjustment of posture, and the quiet signaling embedded in everyday gestures. Each act of compliance or adaptation was an exercise in the mechanisms of influence, a reflection of unseen authority, and an acknowledgement of cost, effort, caution, and the quiet tension that governed behavior. He traced these patterns with patient attention, allowing the interdependence of terrain, settlement, and human response to inform his understanding. The northern lands were alive with invisible structures, and mastery required recognition, patience, and disciplined foresight. Approaching the crossroads at the center of the glen, Aragorn observed a small contingent of rangers stationed strategically near an elevated outcrop. Their coordination was precise, yet unobtrusive. A shift in gaze, a subtle gesture, a repositioning of weight communicated awareness, instruction, and expectation. Aragorn engaged in measured conversation, exchanging information about patrols, settlement movement, and the observable traces of human adaptation. The dialogue was deliberate, reflecting both caution and insight, an acknowledgement of the mechanisms that governed this borderland. Each ranger's presence was an exercise in authority, influence, and anticipation, sustaining stability through observation and subtle signaling rather than confrontation. Aragorn reflected on the cost embedded in this labor. The strain of vigilance, the accumulation of tension, and the quiet weight of responsibility, balanced against the enduring benefit of foresight, resilience, and the capacity to guide consequence with minimal disruption. By early afternoon, he followed the river toward a series of fords and minor bridges, noting the placement of stones, timbers, and footpaths. Each crossing demonstrated the interplay of necessity, observation, and authority. Their design facilitated travel while maintaining oversight, subtly shaping the rhythm of passage and behavior. Aragorn observed travelers adjusting to the placement of obstacles, modulating movement in response to anticipation and expectation. These small, deliberate patterns reflected the principles of stewardship, demonstrating how influence could extend through design, habit, and presence without overt compulsion. The costs were subtle, yet persistent. Fatigue, misjudgment, and cumulative tension weighed upon both travelers and those who maintained oversight. Conversely, the quiet exercise of insight, foresight, and strategic modulation of consequence produced a durable lattice of order, reinforcing cohesion and resilience across both space and time. The afternoon sun grew warmer as Aragorn ascended a low ridge, allowing the valley below to unfold in a mosaic of cultivated land, settlement, and patrol points. The landscape was both beautiful and instructive. Small clusters of dwellings harmonized with terrain, roads and paths reflected subtle rules of efficiency and observation, and the placement of watch points and fences exerted influence through perception rather than force. Aragorn's attention catalogued every detail: the spacing of homes, the flow of movement along paths, the adjustments of posture and pace by those navigating the environment. Each element revealed a principle of governance and consequence, and he traced these lessons with patience, understanding that leadership demanded both observation and reflection. The cost of error was ever present, latent yet powerful, while the benefits of insight and careful orchestration extended quietly, shaping outcomes and maintaining resilience. Later, he approached a small hamlet nestled near the riverbank, where smoke rose from chimneys and the soft rhythm of daily life continued undisturbed. Residents moved with careful purpose, performing tasks that balanced labor, vigilance, and social cohesion. Aragorn noted the alignment of homes and paths, the modulation of labor, and the distribution of attention that sustained order without explicit enforcement. Influence operated quietly through expectation and structure, and the costs of sustaining these mechanisms, effort, attention, and cumulative strain, were embedded subtly, detectable only through careful observation. He reflected upon the enduring value of such systems, their capacity to shape behavior, preserve cohesion, and guide consequence with minimal disruption. Aragorn catalogued these lessons, internalizing both principle and practice as a lattice of comprehension to inform future decisions. By late afternoon, he had followed the river beyond the hamlet, reaching a series of shallow rapids that marked both natural boundary and a locus of subtle human adaptation. Footbridges, stepping stones, and observation points had been arranged with care, regulating both travel and behavior, while maintaining oversight. Aragorn studied the patterns, tracing the mechanisms that allowed influence to extend through subtle design, anticipating response, and modulating behavior. Each adjustment, each gesture, each unspoken rule reflected an understanding of consequence and the interplay between effort and oversight. The cost of misalignment, he observed, was rarely immediate, but accumulated quietly, shaping both perception and outcome in ways that required disciplined attention and foresight to recognize. Conversely, careful observation and strategic intervention produced enduring leverage, maintaining stability and resilience across both landscape and settlement. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, he climbed a gentle rise overlooking the valley. the river below catching the last light and scattering it across fields and cottages. From this vantage, the orchestration of settlement, patrol, and terrain became evident as a coherent system, a living lattice of influence and consequence. Aragorn reflected on the principles he had internalized. Leadership required patient observation, anticipation of cumulative effect, and the subtle calibration of influence rather than overt assertion. Costs were embedded, latent yet consequential, while insight, foresight, and disciplined reflection produced enduring capacity and resilience. He allowed these lessons to settle into quiet understanding, forming a foundation for the decisions, interventions, and judgments that would inevitably demand both patience and discretion. Night fell gradually, and the valley was bathed in silver light, the river murmuring faintly beneath the stars. Aragorn found a concealed resting place, allowing the rhythm of water and wind to anchor reflection. He traced the patterns of human movement, the orchestration of patrols, and the modulation of labor and vigilance across the settlements. Each act, gesture, and adjustment revealed mechanisms of influence, the accumulation of consequence, and the subtle cost of oversight. Leadership, he reflected, was cultivated in these observations. Patience, insight, and careful attention allowed for quiet orchestration, guiding outcomes across both space and time. The northern lands of Gondor whispered their lessons, teaching the value of foresight, the quiet weight of responsibility, and the enduring impact of disciplined observation. In the stillness of night, Aragorn considered the broader lattice he had observed, the river's flow, the alignment of dwellings, the rotation of labor, and the modulation of posture and movement among both settlers and patrols. Each element contributed to a system that extended influence through subtlety rather than force, maintaining stability while embedding costs within effort and attention. The mastery of such mechanisms, he understood, required sustained observation, reflection, and deliberate engagement. His mind traced these interconnections with quiet clarity, forming a framework that would guide both immediate decisions and the patient orchestration of consequence over time. Finally, as the stars shimmered faintly above and the river glimmered beneath moonlight, Aragorn allowed himself a moment of stillness. The valley's rhythm, the interplay of human behavior, environmental structure, and subtle authority formed a coherent framework of insight. Leadership was not simply the assertion of will, but the careful orchestration of influence, observation, and consequence. The northern frontier whispered its lessons in every stone, branch, and ripple of water, and Aragorn, attuned to these rhythms, felt the alignment of understanding, preparation, and purpose. Each observation, reflection, and measured action strengthened the lattice of comprehension that would guide his path, preparing him for the convergence of events that demanded judgment, foresight, and quiet authority. The night deepened, and Aragorn's eyes closed briefly, resting while the river's murmur and the wind through the trees carried the lessons of the day into memory. The northern lands of Gondor, intricate and patient in their own patterns, had offered both instruction and preparation, influence and consequence, cost and reward, vigilance and rest, all converged in a lattice that demanded both observation and restraint. Aragorn breathed deeply, sensing the quiet pulse of readiness within him, a steady undercurrent guiding each step and each decision. The threads of leadership, stewardship, and responsibility intertwined with the rhythms of terrain and human endeavor. And he allowed this alignment to settle, preparing mind and body for the next day's journey, when insight would continue to illuminate the mechanisms of both consequence and opportunity. The morning unfolded in a soft haze, sunlight filtering through the mist that lingered over the northern ridges, bending the light into a fragile lattice across the slopes and valleys below. Aragorn moved deliberately through the undergrowth, each step measured, absorbing the subtle rhythms of the forest, the river, and the distant hum of settlement activity. The lessons of the previous days had settled into a quiet lattice in his mind, the interplay of terrain, human attention, and the invisible threads of authority and consequence. Each bend of the river, each ridge, and each footpath carried traces of the decisions, habits, and vigilance of those who lived under the soft, persistent weight of responsibility. Aragorn's senses, tuned over years of wandering and observation, discerned both detail and pattern, understanding that the world was not merely a landscape to traverse, but a living archive of influence, cost, and consequence. He descended toward a minor settlement perched near a tributary of the main river, its modest structures aligned to sightlines, access to water, and the distribution of labor and oversight. Observing from the cover of trees, Aragorn noted the subtle choreography of life. Children moving along paths with careful awareness of patrols, laborers adjusting their tools to sun and shadow, and watch points occupied with quiet, deliberate attention. Each action, each alignment, and each gesture reflected mechanisms of governance that extended influence without overt assertion. These mechanisms were both delicate and potent, reliant upon cumulative observation, the patient orchestration of attention, and an understanding of cost. Fatigue, tension, and the quiet pressure of sustained vigilance weighed upon the inhabitants, yet the benefit was a resilient, stable lattice of social and territorial order. Aragorn catalogued each observation, aware that these lessons were not abstract, but directly applicable to the larger challenge of stewardship he had undertaken. By mid-morning, he followed the curve of a narrow road that wound along the river's edge, its banks shaded by trees whose roots clutched the soil with patient tenacity. Travelers moved along the path with habitual care, modulating pace, posture, and interaction in response to the subtle signals of authority and the anticipation of consequence. Aragorn observed the interplay between terrain, settlement, and movement, recognizing the principles of influence at work: visibility, expectation, and the quiet pressure of alignment with established norms. The cost of deviation was understated yet real: hesitation, tension, and the gradual erosion of cohesion. But the benefits of subtle control, foresight, and coordinated action were enduring. Each observation strengthened his comprehension of the mechanisms by which leadership was enacted, emphasizing patience, careful assessment, and the judicious modulation of consequence. As the sun climbed, he came upon a group of rangers stationed along a ridgeline, their posture and coordination speaking to both training and experience. Their subtle gestures, glances, and shifts in position reinforced hierarchy and maintained oversight without overt assertion. Aragorn approached carefully, exchanging observations and reflections with a few words that conveyed information while preserving the quiet rhythm of presence. They shared insights about patterns of movement, minor disruptions in routine, and adjustments made to maintain equilibrium across the valley. Aragorn absorbed these observations, noting the delicate balance of exertion, attention, and consequence. The cost of sustained vigilance pressed upon both body and mind, yet it preserved cohesion, foresight, and the capacity to guide outcome with minimal disruption. These lessons, internalized, expanded the lattice of his understanding, preparing him for both immediate decisions and the patient orchestration of influence over time. By early afternoon, he followed the river toward a narrow gorge where the water gathered speed and carved the stone with patient insistence. The terrain demanded attention, shaping movement and limiting options while offering vantage points for observation and control. Aragorn studied how travelers and patrols adjusted to these constraints, noting the mechanisms of adaptation: posture, pacing, alignment with terrain, and the anticipation of obstacles. Authority extended through subtle placement, habitual observation, and strategic positioning rather than force, and Aragorn reflected on the cumulative cost of vigilance, both in effort and attention. Yet the enduring rewards were clear: foresight, resilience, and the ability to anticipate and guide consequence through disciplined observation and thoughtful engagement. Each lesson solidified his comprehension of stewardship, patience, and the careful calibration required to maintain equilibrium in both human and environmental networks. Later, he entered a small valley where cultivated fields stretched toward the river, interspersed with cottages whose placement suggested careful attention to both sightlines and labor. Aragorn observed the subtle orchestration: fences directing movement, paths aligned with patrol routes, and watch points positioned to extend influence without overt coercion. Each detail was part of a larger mechanism, ensuring cohesion and guiding behavior through expectation, habitual practice, and the modulation of attention. The cost of oversight and the weight of responsibility were embedded in these arrangements: fatigue, mental strain, and the quiet accumulation of tension pressed upon those who maintained these systems. Conversely, the benefits were equally subtle but enduring: stability, continuity, and the capacity to shape consequence with minimal disruption. Aragorn catalogued these observations, recognizing that leadership was exercised through insight, reflection, and the patient orchestration of influence rather than immediate assertion of authority. By mid-afternoon, he paused near a small bridge spanning a tributary, observing travelers crossing in careful sequence, adjusting for current and footing. The subtle choreography revealed the principles of influence and anticipation, compliance, modulation, and quiet alignment with expectations. The patterns of movement and interaction illustrated the mechanisms by which order was maintained, extending authority through presence, design, and foresight. Aragorn reflected on the cost of deviation or inattention: hesitation, disruption, and cumulative strain, consequences that often unfolded imperceptibly yet decisively. In contrast, disciplined observation and subtle orchestration produced enduring leverage, reinforcing stability and coherence across both terrain and population. He allowed these reflections to deepen, forming a lattice of understanding that would inform both immediate action and long-term stewardship. As the sun declined, he ascended a low ridge overlooking a cluster of settlements near the river's bend. The interweaving of dwellings, roads, and watch points revealed the deliberate patterns of influence and consequence he had observed across the northern frontier. Aragorn considered the cumulative effect of placement, vigilance, and modulation, the subtle exertion of authority, the patient alignment of labor, and the quiet coordination that preserved cohesion and resilience. Costs were ever present, but often deferred, pressing upon body, mind, and spirit with cumulative weight, while the benefits of foresight, strategic leverage, and disciplined observation extended quietly, sustaining order across time and space. Aragorn allowed these lessons to settle, integrating them into a coherent understanding of leadership, consequence, and the orchestration of influence. By evening, the valley was cast in a gentle twilight, the river reflecting the deepening hues of sky and hill. Aragorn settled at a concealed location near the riverbank, allowing the rhythm of water and wind to anchor his reflection. The patterns of human movement, the coordination of patrols, and the alignment of settlements and terrain formed a living framework of insight. Influence extended subtly, authority was enacted quietly, and consequences were modulated through observation, attention, and reflection. Aragorn recognized that leadership required patience, foresight, and the careful orchestration of multiple threads, each interdependent yet distinct. Costs, while latent, were significant, and misjudgment could ripple across both people and land, while the steady application of insight preserved cohesion, stability, and resilience. As night deepened, he traced the river's path beneath the moonlight, observing how it shaped both the land and human adaptation. Each settlement, patrol, and pathway contributed to a complex lattice of influence and consequence, a system in which attention, patience, and reflection guided outcomes more effectively than overt assertion of force. Aragorn considered the broader implications. Stewardship demanded mastery of both visible and hidden mechanisms, the anticipation of cumulative effect, and the disciplined modulation of engagement. Errors, though often subtle, could accumulate into disruption, while the patient exercise of insight and observation produced enduring alignment and stability. Finally, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, absorbing the lessons of the day and the quiet rhythm of the valley. The northern frontier of Gondor revealed its mechanisms in footpaths, fields, dwellings, and patrols, each a testament to the interplay of attention, consequence, and authority. Aragorn felt the weight of responsibility settle with clarity and resolve. Leadership was not mere assertion, but the patient orchestration of influence, observation, and consequence. The river whispered in its steady cadence, the wind rustled through trees in measured rhythm, and the patterns of settlement and vigilance coalesced into a lattice of understanding that would guide both thought and action. He breathed deeply, attuned to the pulse of terrain, lineage, and duty, readying himself for the convergence of decisions, judgments, and subtle interventions that would define the path forward. The stars emerged gradually, mirrored faintly upon the river, and Aragorn permitted a quiet rest, the lessons of vigilance, alignment, and consequence settling into memory. The northern lands of Gondor had offered instruction in patience, foresight, and the measured exercise of authority. Every observation, reflection, and small adjustment contributed to a growing framework of comprehension, one that would prepare him to act decisively yet subtly when circumstances required. In the quiet of night, the interplay of human behavior, environmental structure, and the modulation of consequence revealed a lattice of insight, a foundation upon which leadership, stewardship, and the reclamation of Gondor's legacy could be exercised with care, discernment, and quiet strength. The pale light of dawn touched the valley with a soft, diffused glow, casting long shadows that crept gently across fields, cottages, and the river's winding course. Aragorn moved along a narrow path above the water, his steps deliberate, almost meditative, attuned to the subtle symphony of natural rhythm and human presence. The morning mist lingered, dissolving slowly as sunlight struck leaves and stone, revealing patterns etched across terrain and settlement alike. Each observation offered a thread of understanding. The alignment of homes to sightlines, the placement of fences and watch points, the flow of water and the paths that guided both labor and travel. These were not merely details, they were mechanisms, living instruments through which influence, authority, and consequence flowed quietly, invisibly, shaping behavior across both time and space. Aragorn traced each pattern with patience, noting the latent cost in vigilance, labor, and attention, alongside the enduring benefits of foresight, cohesion, and subtle leverage. By mid-morning, he descended toward a small crossroads where two minor roads converged near a cluster of cottages. The inhabitants moved with habitual care, their gestures and pace attuned to both routine and the quiet presence of observation. Aragorn watched as a few travelers paused, exchanging brief words and glances, their actions moderated by expectation and the anticipation of response. The mechanisms of influence were evident here. Placement of dwellings, positioning of watch points, and even the angle of sunlight on the walls all contributed to the quiet orchestration of behavior. Costs were embedded in these patterns: fatigue, accumulated tension, and the constant mental calibration required to anticipate both human and environmental response. Yet the benefits, though subtle, were profound: stability, continuity, and the capacity to shape consequence without confrontation. Aragorn absorbed these lessons with the disciplined attention of one attuned to both pattern and principle, understanding that leadership relied upon observation, reflection, and subtle calibration, rather than immediate assertion of force. He moved onward, following the river, as it curved toward a shallow gorge where the current quickened, churning over rocks and gravel with steady insistence. The terrain shaped movement and constrained options, offering both challenges and opportunities for observation and oversight. Aragorn noted travelers adjusting posture, pace, and alignment in response to these constraints, tracing the mechanisms by which environmental features extended influence and guided behavior. Patrol points and concealed observation locations augmented these natural effects, allowing authority to operate quietly yet decisively. The cost of misjudgment, he recognized, was cumulative: fatigue, minor errors, and the erosion of coordinated patterns could ripple outward, imperceptibly altering outcomes across both settlement and terrain. Conversely, patient observation and careful orchestration produced enduring leverage, stabilizing both social and environmental systems. Each realization deepened Aragorn's comprehension of stewardship, foresight, and the disciplined exercise of influence. By noon, he reached a small hamlet perched on a gentle rise overlooking the river, its cottages aligned with subtle precision, maximizing visibility, access to water, and coordination of labor. Aragorn observed the quiet choreography of daily life. children moving along predetermined paths, laborers adjusting work according to sun and shadow, and watch points maintained with measured attention. The residents' actions reflected subtle enforcement of expectation, a system of guidance and control that operated without overt assertion. Costs were embedded, latent yet persistent, pressing upon both mind and body with the quiet weight of responsibility. The benefits, however, extended across time and space: cohesion, resilience, and the capacity to shape outcome with minimal disruption. Aragorn reflected on these patterns as both practical and instructive, understanding that the management of consequence required patience, insight, and the subtle orchestration of multiple threads simultaneously. As the afternoon sun climbed, he followed a secondary path toward a grove of ancient trees, their trunks wide and gnarled, roots twisting across the forest floor. The forest itself exerted influence over movement, dictating choice through density, visibility, and terrain, while offering vantage points for observation and subtle control. Aragorn moved carefully, noting both natural and human adaptations, stepping stones across small streams, markers etched in bark, and concealed paths known only to those who had traversed them before. Each detail revealed a mechanism of guidance, expectation, or oversight, demonstrating the interplay of environment, habit, and authority. Costs were embedded in vigilance, navigation, and attention, pressing subtly upon those who engaged with these systems, while the benefits, foresight, stability, and alignment, remained quietly enduring. Aragorn traced these lessons with patient attention, internalizing both principle and practice as a lattice of understanding that would inform decisions and interventions across both terrain and people. Later, he approached a ridge overlooking a broader valley, where the river fanned into tributaries, the settlements arrayed like careful patterns against the land. Patrols moved along paths with deliberate rhythm, watch points maintained with disciplined attention, and the placement of dwellings suggested coordination extending beyond immediate necessity. Aragorn observed the subtle interplay of influence, noting how behavior adapted to expectation, observation, and spatial arrangement. Each element reflected both cost and benefit, fatigue, accumulated tension, and constant calibration weighed upon those sustaining oversight, while foresight, cohesion, and the capacity to shape outcome persisted quietly, structuring behavior across both space and generations. He allowed these reflections to settle, forming a coherent understanding of stewardship, authority, and the disciplined orchestration required to maintain equilibrium in the northern frontier. By late afternoon, he descended toward a narrow ford where the river's flow slowed, allowing easier passage. Travelers crossed in small groups, adjusting their pace, posture, and interaction in subtle response to both terrain and expectation. Aragorn noted the mechanisms at play: alignment with natural cues, adherence to established routes, and the modulation of behavior in accordance with unseen patterns of authority. These small, habitual adaptations extended influence quietly, regulating movement and maintaining stability without overt coercion. Costs were embedded in attentiveness, effort, and subtle tension, while benefits persisted in stability, resilience, and the preservation of coherence across social and environmental systems. Aragorn allowed these observations to deepen into reflection, consolidating the lessons of terrain, settlement, and behavior into a coherent lattice of insight. As evening approached, He ascended a gentle rise overlooking a cluster of cottages near the river bend, the last rays of sunlight scattering across the fields in warm hues. From this vantage, the orchestration of settlement, patrol, and terrain was evident. Homes aligned for observation, paths shaped to regulate flow, and watchpoints maintained to extend subtle influence. Aragorn considered the cumulative effect of these mechanisms, noting both cost and benefit. The quiet exertion of effort, mental strain, and the constant calibration of expectation contrasted with the enduring stability, cohesion, and foresight produced through careful observation. He reflected on leadership as a practice of attentive orchestration, requiring patience, insight, and measured intervention rather than immediate assertion of force. Each observation, subtle insight, and careful reflection strengthened his understanding of stewardship, influence, and consequence. By nightfall, the valley lay under a deepening sky, the river glimmering faintly under moonlight, carrying both sound and lesson along its winding course. Aragorn settled near a concealed spot beneath a cluster of trees, letting the rhythm of water and wind anchor thought. He traced the patterns of movement, the orchestration of labor and patrol, and the alignment of settlements with terrain. Influence extended quietly through design, expectation, and observation. Authority was enacted through presence, reflection, and subtle calibration. Costs were latent yet persistent, while the benefits of insight, foresight, and patience endured across space and time. Aragorn allowed these lessons to coalesce into a lattice of understanding, preparing him for both the immediate demands of vigilance and the long arc of stewardship across northern Gondor. In the stillness of night, he considered the river's path, the alignment of cottages, and the modulation of behavior across both traveler and resident. Each element reflected mechanisms of influence, consequence, and cumulative effect. Aragorn recognized that the mastery of such systems required not only observation and insight, but patient reflection and measured engagement. Errors, though subtle, could ripple outward, affecting cohesion, stability, and outcome, while disciplined attention ensured alignment, foresight, and resilience. The northern frontier whispered its lessons in stone, water, and movement, and Aragorn, attuned to these rhythms, absorbed instruction in patience, consequence, and the subtle exercise of authority. Finally, he allowed himself a moment of quiet, listening to the river's steady murmur and the gentle rustle of leaves in the night air. Patterns of behavior, coordination of labor, and the orchestration of observation coalesced into a living framework of insight. Leadership, he reflected, was cultivated not through force, but through careful observation, reflection, and the disciplined modulation of consequence. The lessons of the day, embedded in terrain, settlement, and subtle human adaptation, settled into memory as both guidance and preparation. Aragorn breathed deeply, attuned to the pulse of land, lineage, and responsibility, readying himself for the convergence of events, decisions, and subtle interventions that would define the path forward in reclaiming Gondor's enduring legacy. The stars multiplied overhead, mirrored faintly upon the river, and Aragorn rested, letting the quiet rhythm of water, wind, and distant human activity anchor thought. Influence and consequence, vigilance and patience, cost and reward, each thread intertwined, forming a lattice that guided insight, action, and reflection. The northern lands had offered instruction in both principle and practice, teaching the enduring value of foresight, the quiet weight of responsibility, and the patient orchestration of authority. Aragorn, listening attentively, felt the alignment of understanding, preparation, and purpose settling into mind and body, strengthening the lattice of comprehension that would guide each decision, observation, and step along the path ahead.